reveal to him about surviving the events ahead will shake you to your core. But before I share this terrifying testimony, I need you to type Amen in the comments right now to show God you're ready to hear the truth. Because what you're about to witness isn't just another story, it's a warning that could save your life. My name is David Matthews, and I'm a paramedic in Phoenix, Arizona. For 15 years, I've seen death up close. I pulled bodies from wreckage, performed CPR on children, and held the hands of people taking their final breaths. I thought I understood the boundary between life and death. I was wrong. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened to my 14-year-old son Marcus on July 27th, just 6 days ago. That Saturday started like any other summer day. Marcus was excited about going to his friend Tyler's birthday party across town. My wife Sarah had packed him a gift, and I remember watching him adjust his seatbelt in the passenger seat of our Honda Civic. He was talking about starting high school in a few weeks. Nervous but excited. His voice carried that teenage mix of confidence and uncertainty that always made me smile. The intersection of Mill Avenue and University Drive, that's where everything changed. We were stopped at a red light when I saw it in my peripheral vision. A white pickup truck speeding through the intersection, running the red light at what had to be 60 miles per hour. Time slowed to a crawl. I could see the driver wasn't looking at the road. His head was down, probably texting. I tried to accelerate forward, but physics doesn't negotiate with desperation. The impact threw our car 30 feet. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, even in my years as a first responder. Metal crushing, glass exploding, and then something worse. Silence. Complete, terrifying silence. When I came to, maybe 30 seconds later, I was hanging upside down, blood trickling from my forehead. But my injuries didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the boy next to me. Marcus wasn't moving. His head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach drop. Blood was pooling beneath him, and when I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse, I found nothing. My training kicked in automatically. I started chest compressions right there in the wreckage, counting aloud, praying between numbers. Other drivers had stopped. Someone was calling 911, but I knew. After 15 years of emergency medicine, I knew. The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes. My colleagues, people I'd worked alongside for years, took over CPR while the fire department cut us out of the car. I watched them work on my son with the same techniques I'd used on hundreds of strangers. The irony was crushing. Here I was, a man who'd saved countless lives, and I couldn't save the one that mattered most. They loaded Marcus into the ambulance, and I rode in the back, watching the monitor flatline for 18 minutes. 18 minutes of nothing. No pulse, no brain activity, no signs of life. The emergency room team at Phoenix General worked for another 20 minutes before Dr. Rodriguez, the attending physician, looked at me with eyes I'd seen too many times before. The look that says we've done everything we can. Sarah arrived just as they were preparing to call it. She collapsed against me, and we held each other as our world crumbled. The nurses gave us privacy to say goodbye. I remember touching Marcus's hand, still warm but lifeless, and whispering that I was sorry.
This is the quickest way to clear out stuck poop.
The number one food for
Sorry I couldn't protect him. Sorry I couldn't save him. Sorry we'd never see him graduate, never walk him down the aisle, never hold his children. But then something impossible happened. Something that defied every law of medicine I'd studied and every case I'd witnessed in my career. At exactly 3:47 p.m., 43 minutes after his heart had stopped, the monitor began beeping. Slow at first, then stronger. Dr. Rodriguez rushed back in, checking the equipment, convinced it was a malfunction. But Marcus's chest was rising and falling. His pulse was strengthening. His brain activity was returning. Within minutes, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around the room, confused but alert. The medical team was stunned. In 15 years of emergency medicine, I'd never seen anything like it. Dead for 43 minutes, with no oxygen to the brain, no circulation, no life signs whatsoever. Yet here he was, sitting up, asking for water, showing no signs of brain damage or trauma. Dr. Rodriguez pulled me aside. He was shaking. He told me that in 30 years of emergency medicine, he'd never witnessed a recovery like this. The brain can only survive without oxygen for 3 to 5 minutes before permanent damage occurs. Marcus had been gone for over 40 minutes. By every medical standard, what we were witnessing was impossible. But the real shock came when Marcus started talking about where he'd been. His first words weren't about the accident or the pain. They were about Jesus. My son, who'd been raised in church but never shown particular interest in spiritual matters, began describing an encounter that would change everything we thought we knew about life, death, and what's coming. He told us he remembered the impact, the sensation of leaving his body, and then finding himself in a place of indescribable light. Not the tunnel of light people often describe, but something far more profound. He said it was like standing inside pure love itself, where every question he'd ever had was answered without words. That's when Jesus appeared to him, not as a figure from a stained glass window or a painting, but as a living presence more real than anything he'd ever experienced. Marcus described eyes that contained both infinite compassion and absolute authority. A voice that spoke directly to his spirit without using sound. A presence that radiated power beyond human comprehension. But what Jesus showed him next would shatter our understanding of what's coming in the months ahead. Marcus spoke about visions of events beginning in late 2025, catastrophes and changes that would test every person on Earth. He described seeing a timeline, like a calendar unfolding before him, with specific months marked by events that would shake the foundations of society. Jesus didn't just show him disasters. He revealed survival strategies, spiritual preparations, and warnings about deceptions that would fool even the most faithful. Marcus saw two groups of people during these events: those who were prepared and protected, and those who were caught completely off guard. The difference between them wasn't wealth or location or even religious affiliation. It was something deeper. The medical staff couldn't explain what they were witnessing. Here was a boy who should have been brain dead, speaking with clarity and wisdom that seemed far beyond his 14 years. Nurses who'd worked with trauma patients for decades said they'd never heard anything like the detail and coherence of Marcus's account. Sarah and I listened in amazement as our son described not just the spiritual realm he'd visited, but specific instructions he'd been given about the coming year. Jesus had told him that time was running short, that events prophesied for centuries were about to unfold, and that those who weren't spiritually prepared would face trials unlike anything in human history. But perhaps the most shocking part of Marcus's testimony was what Jesus revealed about children. He said that many young people would be given similar visions and warnings in the months ahead, that God was raising up a generation of youth to sound the alarm while there was still time to prepare. Marcus was just the beginning. The doctors kept him for observation for 3 days, running test after test, MRI scans, neurological exams, psychological evaluations. Everything came back normal. Better than normal, actually. Marcus showed no signs of trauma, no brain damage, no psychological distress from either the accident or his near-death experience. If anything, he seemed more mature, more focused, carrying an urgency about sharing what he'd been shown. On the 3rd day, as we prepared to take him home, Marcus grabbed both Sarah's hand and mine. His grip was firm, his eyes clear and determined. The machines around us beeped steadily, confirming what we could hardly believe. Our son was alive, healthy, and forever changed by an encounter that defied explanation. That's when he spoke the words that would launch us into a mission we never expected. Looking directly into our eyes, with a seriousness that seemed far older than his 14 years, Marcus said the 5 words that would change everything. I have to tell you something. What he shared next about the specific events Jesus showed him for 2025, the exact months when catastrophes would strike, and the survival strategies that could mean the difference between life and death, would keep us awake for days. But more than that, it would compel us to share this warning with anyone who would listen. Because according to what Jesus revealed to our son during those 43 minutes on the other side, time is running out faster than anyone realizes. The events that will reshape our world aren't coming someday in the distant future. They're coming within months, and most people are completely unprepared for what's ahead. What Marcus told us next would shake the foundation of everything we thought we knew about the year ahead. His voice carried a weight that seemed impossible for someone his age, each word deliberate and urgent. Sarah squeezed my hand tighter as our son began to describe what Jesus had revealed to him about surviving the events that would unfold in 2025. "Dad, Mom," Marcus began, his eyes never leaving ours. "Jesus showed me a calendar, but it wasn't like any calendar I'd ever seen. Each month glowed with different colors, and some months pulsed like warning lights. He told me that 2025 would be the year when everything changes, not just for America, but for the whole world." I felt my throat tighten. As a paramedic, I'd always focused on immediate emergencies, life and death situations happening right now. But what Marcus was describing sounded like a series of catastrophes stretching across an entire year. Sarah's nursing background had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but I could see her hands trembling as she processed our son's words. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "The first thing Jesus showed me was that most people won't see it coming. They'll be living their normal lives, going to work, planning vacations, worrying about everyday things. But underneath all that normalcy, something massive is building, like pressure in the earth before an earthquake, except this pressure is spiritual." He paused, looking out the hospital window toward the Phoenix skyline. Jesus said that the events of 2025 wouldn't just be natural disasters or political chaos. They'd be tests. Tests to separate those who truly know him from those who just think they do. He called it the Great Sifting. The term sent chills down my spine. I'd grown up in church, attended Sunday services regularly, considered myself a believer, but the way Marcus spoke about knowing Jesus versus thinking you know him made me question everything. Had I been fooling myself all these years? The calendar Jesus showed me had specific months marked. Marcus continued. August was glowing orange, like a warning. He showed me massive flooding, but not just from rain. Something about underground water systems failing across multiple states simultaneously. Cities that never flood would be underwater within hours. Sarah leaned forward. "Which cities, Marcus? Did he show you which cities?" He didn't give me exact names, but I saw the shapes of coastlines changing. Places that people thought were safe inland suddenly weren't safe anymore. Jesus said that those who survive August would be the ones who learn to listen to his voice, instead of relying on weather reports and government warnings. The specificity was unsettling. This wasn't vague prophecy about distant tribulations. Marcus was describing events with the precision of someone who'd seen them happening. But what really disturbed me was the implication that official sources couldn't be trusted to provide adequate warning. "May was different," Marcus went on. "That month pulsed red, like a heartbeat. Jesus showed me something happening to the food supply. Not just shortages, but contamination. He said people would be fighting over basic groceries, and that many would get sick from eating food they thought was safe." I thought about the complex supply chains that brought food to Phoenix from all over the country. If something disrupted those systems, our city of over 1 million people would descend into chaos within days. But contamination was worse than shortage. At least with shortage, you knew what you were dealing with. "But here's what Jesus told me about surviving," Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost otherworldly authority. He said the people who make it through won't be the ones with the most supplies or the best hiding places. They'll be the ones who learn to hear his voice clearly. The ones who can distinguish between his leading and their own fear. This was getting into territory that challenged everything I thought I knew about emergency preparedness. My training focused on equipment, procedures, backup plans. But Marcus was talking about something far more intangible, yet apparently far more crucial. "Jesus showed me families," Marcus continued. "Some had storerooms full of food and water, generators, medical supplies, everything you'd think they'd need. But when the tests came, they panicked. They fought among themselves. They made decisions based on fear instead of faith. and it cost them everything. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. What happened to them? They didn't physically die, Marcus replied. But something in them died. Jesus called it spiritual death while still breathing. They became so consumed with trying to save their physical lives that they lost their souls in the process. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. I was struggling to process what our son was telling us. It sounded like a paradox. How do you prepare for catastrophe without becoming consumed by fear? How do you take practical steps while maintaining spiritual focus? Then Jesus showed me the other families, Marcus said. And for the first time since he'd started talking, a smile crossed his face. These people had some supplies, but nothing excessive. What they had was different. They had peace. Even when the disasters hit, even when everything around them was chaos, they stayed calm. They knew exactly what to do and when to do it. How? I asked. How did they know? Because they'd learned to recognize his voice before the crisis hit, Marcus explained. Jesus said that the people who try to hear him for the first time during an emergency won't be able to distinguish his voice from all the other voices screaming in their heads. But those who'd been practicing, who'd been listening and obeying in small things, they'd recognize his voice immediately, even in the middle of chaos. This was hitting me personally. When had I last spent time actually listening for God's voice? Sure, I prayed before meals and when emergencies got really bad at work. But listening, actually sitting quietly and trying to discern divine guidance, I couldn't remember the last time. There's more, Marcus said, and his expression grew more serious. Jesus showed me that August would bring something no one expects. He called it the economic collapse, but not like the recessions people talk about on the news. This would be complete system failure. Banks, credit cards, digital payments, all of it would stop working within a single week. Sarah gasped. What would people do for money? That's just it, Marcus replied. Jesus said money wouldn't matter anymore. The people who survive August would be the ones who'd learned to depend on him for their daily bread instead of their bank accounts. The ones who'd been practicing generosity instead of hoarding. I thought about our own finances. We had savings, retirement accounts, a good credit score. We'd always been responsible with money, planning for the future. But Marcus was describing a scenario where all of that became worthless overnight. The thought was terrifying. But the strangest part, Marcus continued, was what Jesus told me about September. He said that month would be when the great deception begins. False signs and wonders that would fool almost everyone. Even people who consider themselves strong believers would be deceived. What kind of signs? Sarah asked. Miracles that aren't from God, Marcus replied. Healings, supernatural events, even voices claiming to be divine. Jesus said the deception would be so convincing that if it were possible, even the elect would be fooled. The only way to avoid it would be to know his true voice so well that you'd immediately recognize the counterfeits. This was getting into territory that made me deeply uncomfortable. I'd always believed in miracles, in God's supernatural power, but the idea that miraculous events could be deceptive, that they could actually lead people away from God, was a concept I'd never seriously considered. October through December, Marcus said, his voice growing quieter. Jesus showed me things that were hard to watch. Natural disasters, unlike anything in recorded history. But he kept emphasizing that the physical events weren't the real test. The real test was whether people would turn to him or turn away from him when everything they trusted in failed. He looked directly at me. Dad, you've seen people in emergencies. You know how some people stay calm and help others, while some people panic and make everything worse? I nodded. In 15 years of emergency response, I'd seen the full spectrum of human reactions to crisis. Jesus said 2025 would be like that, but on a global scale, Marcus continued. The people who'd been practicing faith in small things would rise to the occasion. They'd become leaders, helpers, sources of hope. But the people who'd only been playing at faith would fall apart completely. The weight of what Marcus was telling us was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about surviving physical disasters. It was about a spiritual test that would reveal what people really believed when everything external was stripped away. But here's the most important thing, Marcus said. leaning forward with an intensity that made both Sarah and me hold our breath. Jesus told me that none of this has to be scary for people who truly know him. He said that for his real followers, 2025 would be the most exciting year of their lives. Not because the events themselves would be pleasant, but because they'd finally get to see his power and protection in ways they'd only read about in the Bible. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Marcus, this is so much to take in. How are we supposed to prepare for something like this? Our son smiled again. And in that moment, he looked both 14 and ancient at the same time. Jesus gave me specific instructions about that too, Mom. He said the preparation isn't what most people think. It's not about stockpiling supplies or moving to remote locations. It's about learning to live by faith right now, in our normal, everyday lives. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means starting to listen for his voice in small decisions, Marcus replied. What to eat for breakfast, which route to take to work, whether to help a stranger or mind your own business. Jesus said that people who learn to hear and obey his voice in ordinary situations will automatically know what to do when extraordinary situations arise. This was simultaneously the simplest and most challenging thing I'd ever heard. Simple because it didn't require special knowledge or expensive preparations. Challenging because it required a level of spiritual sensitivity I wasn't sure I possessed. He also said something about community, Marcus continued. The people who make it through 2025 won't be lone wolves or isolated families. They'll be connected to others who are also listening to his voice, but not just any church or religious group. Jesus was very specific about this. He said many churches and religious organizations would actually become part of the deception. How do we know which ones are real? Sarah asked. By their fruit, Marcus replied immediately. Jesus said to look for communities where people actually love each other in practical ways, where there's real forgiveness, where people are willing to sacrifice for others. Not just talk about love, but demonstrate it consistently. I thought about our own church. We attended regularly, contributed financially, participated in some social events. But did we really love each other in the way Marcus was describing? If crisis hit, would we actually take care of each other? Or would we retreat into self-preservation mode? There's one more thing, Marcus said, and his voice carried a new note of urgency. Jesus told me that I'm not the only one he's speaking to this way. He said that all over the world, he's giving visions and warnings to people who will listen, especially young people. He called us the last generation of watchmen. The phrase sent shivers through me. A generation of young people receiving supernatural warnings about coming catastrophe. It sounded like something from the book of Joel, where God promised to pour out his spirit on sons and daughters who would prophesy. But Dad, Marcus continued, looking directly into my eyes, Jesus said that many of the adults who receive these warnings won't believe them. They'll explain them away as trauma, or imagination, or religious fanaticism. He said that's why he's speaking to kids and teenagers, because we're more willing to believe something impossible is possible. I felt convicted. How many times had I dismissed unusual spiritual experiences as psychological phenomena? How many warnings had I missed because they didn't fit my rational, that medical understanding of how the world works? So what do we do now? Sarah asked. How do we live with this knowledge? Marcus reached for both our hands. Jesus said to start preparing our hearts immediately, not with fear, but with expectation. He said that for people who truly belong to him, the events of 2025 would be like watching the greatest adventure movie ever made, except they'd be starring in it and they'd know how it ends. As I sat there holding my son's hand, feeling the steady pulse that had been absent for 43 minutes, I realized that our lives had just taken a turn into territory I'd never imagined. We were no longer just a normal family dealing with the aftermath of a car accident. We'd become carriers of a message that could change everything for anyone willing to listen. But the question that haunted me as we prepared to leave the hospital was whether I had the courage to believe my own son, and whether I was ready to live as if everything he told us was absolutely true. The drive home from the hospital was surreal. Sarah sat in the back seat with Marcus, neither of them speaking much, while I navigated the familiar Phoenix streets that somehow looked different now. Everything looked different. The strip malls, the traffic lights, the people going about their daily routines, all of it seemed fragile somehow, like a movie set that could be dismantled at any moment. Marcus stared out the window, and I caught glimpses of him in the rear-view mirror. There was something in his expression I'd never seen before, not just maturity, but a kind of weight, like he was carrying knowledge that pressed down on his shoulders. Every few minutes he'd nod slightly, as if confirming something to himself. When we pulled into our driveway, our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, hurried over. She'd been watering her garden, but dropped the hose when she saw us. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, tears in her eyes. "We heard about the accident. How is he?" I looked at Marcus, unsure how to answer. "How do you explain that your son died for nearly an hour and came back with prophecies about the end times?" "He's going to be fine," I said finally. "Better than fine." Mrs. Henderson hugged Marcus gently. "You gave us all quite a scare, young man." Marcus smiled at her, but it was a different smile than before. Sadder, but also more knowing. "Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly, "do you go to church?" She seemed surprised by the question. "Well, sometimes. Christmas and Easter mostly. Why do you ask?" "You might want to start going more regularly," Marcus replied, "and not just going. Really listening." Mrs. Henderson laughed nervously, glancing at Sarah and me. "Well, aren't you the little preacher now?" But something in Marcus's expression made her laugh fade. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe I will, honey. Maybe I will." That evening, as Sarah made dinner and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Marcus pulled me aside. "Dad, I need to tell you the rest. The part I couldn't say in the hospital." We sat on the back patio, watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The temperature was dropping from the day's heat, and cicadas were beginning their evening chorus. It should have been peaceful, but I felt an electric tension in the air. "Jesus showed me something else," Marcus began. "About why he brought me back. About why he's giving these warnings now." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Dad, do you remember the story of Jonah and Nineveh?" I nodded. God sent Jonah to warn the city that it would be destroyed in 40 days. "Right. And what happened?" "The people repented, and God spared the city." Marcus looked directly at me. "That's what this is, Dad. These warnings about 2025, they're not set in stone. Jesus showed me 2 different timelines, 2 different versions of how next year could unfold." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "In one timeline, everything happens exactly like I described. The floods, the economic collapse, the deceptions, all of it. Millions of people suffer because they weren't prepared spiritually. But in the other timeline," Marcus's voice grew excited. "In the other timeline, enough people wake up and turn to God that he holds back some of the worst parts." "Like Nineveh," I whispered. "Exactly like Nineveh. Jesus said that's why he's sending warnings through kids and teenagers and ordinary people like us. Not to scare people into panic, but to give them a chance to choose a different path." Sarah joined us on the patio, carrying 3 glasses of iced tea. She'd obviously been listening from inside. "So what you're saying is that these prophecies could change based on how people respond?" Marcus nodded. "But Dad, Mom, here's the thing that really scared me. Jesus showed me that most people who hear warnings like this will do one of 2 things. Either they'll dismiss it completely, or they'll get so focused on the physical preparations that they'll miss the spiritual point entirely." I thought about my own initial reaction. My first instinct had been to start making lists of supplies to buy, safe locations to consider, practical steps to take. But Marcus was suggesting that might be exactly the wrong approach. He said the people who try to save their lives will lose them. Marcus continued, "But the people who lose their lives for his sake will find them." That doesn't mean being reckless or stupid. It means trusting him more than trusting your own preparations. Sarah set down her tea glass with a slight tremor. "Marcus, this is asking us to completely rethink everything we've believed about security and safety." "I know, Mom. Jesus knew it would be hard. That's why he gave me specific instructions about how to start." "What kind of instructions?" I asked. Marcus pulled a small notebook from his pocket. I hadn't seen him write anything down at the hospital, but the pages were covered with his handwriting. He told me to write down everything, but also to write down the steps for getting ready. He flipped through several pages. First, he said to start each day by asking him what he wants you to focus on. Not what you think needs to be done, but what he wants you to focus on. He said most people live their whole lives without ever asking that question. I realized I'd never asked that question. Not once. I woke up each day with my own agenda, my own priorities, occasionally asking God to bless my plans, but never asking what his plans might be. Second, Marcus continued, he said to practice hearing his voice in safe situations. Like when you're deciding what to have for lunch, ask him. When you're choosing which route to take to work, ask him. When someone asks for help, ask him whether to help or not. That seems almost trivial, Sarah said. That's what I thought too, Marcus replied. But Jesus said that people who can't hear his voice about trivial things will never hear it about important things. He said it's like learning to play piano. You start with simple songs before you try to play a symphony. What else? I asked. Third, he said to find other people who are also learning to listen to his voice. He was very specific about this, Dad. He said not to look for people who talk about God a lot, but people who actually obey what they hear from him. This was challenging. How do you identify people who are genuinely hearing from God versus people who think they are? How do you avoid getting caught up with religious fanatics while still connecting with authentic believers? Fourth, Marcus went on, he said to start practicing generosity now while we still have abundance. He said that the people who learn to give sacrificially before the crisis will find supernatural provision during the crisis. Sarah and I exchanged glances. We were generous by most standards, tithing to our church, contributing to charities. But sacrificial giving, that was a different level entirely. And fifth, Marcus said, closing the notebook, he said to get rid of anything in our lives that competes with our relationship with him. Not necessarily bad things, but things that distract us from hearing his voice clearly. I thought about my own life. Work often consumed 60 hours a week. When I wasn't working, I was usually watching sports or news, playing on my phone, doing... Here's the thing that really scared me. Jesus showed me that most people who hear warnings like this will do one of two things. Either they'll dismiss it completely, or they'll get so focused on the physical preparations that they'll miss the spiritual point entirely. I thought about my own initial reaction. My first instinct had been to start making lists of supplies to buy, safe locations to consider, practical steps to take. But Marcus was suggesting that might be exactly the wrong approach. He said the people who try to save their lives will lose them. Marcus continued, but the people who lose their lives for his sake will find them. That doesn't mean being reckless or stupid. It means trusting him more than trusting your own preparations. Sarah set down her tea glass with a slight tremor. Marcus, this is asking us to completely rethink everything we've believed about security and safety. I know, Mom. Jesus knew it would be hard. That's why he gave me specific instructions about how to start. What kind of instructions? I asked. Marcus pulled a small notebook from his pocket. I hadn't seen him write anything down at the hospital, but the pages were covered with his handwriting. He told me to write down everything, but also to write down the steps for getting ready. He flipped through several pages. First, he said to start each day by asking him what he wants you to focus on. Not what you think needs to be done, but what he wants you to focus on. He said most people live their whole lives without ever asking that question. I realized I'd never asked that question. Not once. I woke up each day with my own agenda, my own priorities, occasionally asking God to bless my plans, but never asking what his plans might be. Second, Marcus continued, he said to practice hearing his voice in safe situations. Like when you're deciding what to have for lunch, ask him. When you're choosing which route to take to work, ask him. When someone asks for help, ask him whether to help or not. That seems almost trivial, Sarah said. That's what I thought too, Marcus replied. But Jesus said that people who can't hear his voice about trivial things will never hear it about important things. He said it's like learning to play piano. You start with simple songs before you try to play a symphony. What else? I asked. Third, he said to find other people who are also learning to listen to his voice. He was very specific about this, Dad. He said not to look for people who talk about God a lot, but people who actually obey what they hear from him. This was challenging. How do you identify people who are genuinely hearing from God versus people who think they are? How do you avoid getting caught up with religious fanatics while still connecting with authentic believers? Fourth, Marcus went on, he said to start practicing generosity now while we still have abundance. He said that the people who learn to give sacrificially before the crisis will find supernatural provision during the crisis. Sarah and I exchanged glances. We were generous by most standards, tithing to our church, contributing to charities. But sacrificial giving, that was a different level entirely. And fifth, Marcus said, closing the notebook, he said to get rid of anything in our lives that competes with our relationship with him. Not necessarily bad things, but things that distract us from hearing his voice clearly. I thought about my own life. Work often consumed 60 hours a week. When I wasn't working, I was usually watching sports or news, playing on my phone, doing projects around the house. How much time did I actually spend in silence, listening for God's voice? Marcus, Sarah said gently, what you're describing sounds like becoming a monk or something. How do we live normal lives while doing all this? Marcus smiled. That's the beautiful part, Mom. Jesus said that when people start living this way, their normal lives become supernatural. They don't have to withdraw from the world. The world starts looking different because they're seeing it through his eyes. As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I felt something shifting inside me. Not just belief in what Marcus was telling us, but a deep hunger for the kind of relationship with God he was describing. A relationship where divine guidance was normal, where supernatural provision was expected, where crisis became opportunity. There's one more thing, Marcus said quietly. Jesus told me that the people who receive warnings like this have a responsibility to share them. Not to force anyone to believe, but to make sure the warning gets out there for those who have ears to hear. What does that mean for us? I asked. It means we can't just prepare ourselves and hope for the best, Marcus replied. We have to find ways to warn others. Some people will listen, some won't, but Jesus said that's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is just to be faithful messengers. The magnitude of what Marcus was suggesting hit me. He wasn't just asking us to change our own lives. He was asking us to become modern-day Jonahs, carrying a warning message to anyone who would listen. Will people believe us? Sarah asked. Marcus shrugged. Some will. Jesus said that people who are already hungry for truth will recognize it when they hear it. People who aren't ready will think we're crazy. But that's okay. Jonah probably looked pretty crazy too. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each of us processing the enormity of what lay ahead. Finally, I reached over and took Marcus's hand, the same hand I'd held in that hospital room, the hand that had been cold and lifeless for 43 minutes. Son, I said, I believe you. I believe every word you've told us, and I'm ready to start living like it's all true. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Me too. Whatever it takes. Marcus squeezed both our hands. Then let's start tonight. Let's ask Jesus what he wants us to do first. As we bowed our heads together on that warm Phoenix evening, I realized that the car accident 6 days ago hadn't just given us our son back. It had given us a mission, a purpose, and a completely new way of understanding what it means to live by faith. The events of 2025 were still months away, but our preparation was beginning right now. Not with stockpiles or bunkers, but with 3 people learning to recognize the voice of God in the ordinary moments of everyday life. Because according to what Jesus had revealed to our 14-year-old son during his brief journey to the other side, that voice would be the only navigation system that mattered when the world as we knew it began to change forever. And as we prayed together under the Arizona stars, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just hope, but anticipation. Whatever was coming in 2025, we wouldn't face it alone. We'd face it as a family, guided by a voice that had already proven it could bring the dead back to life. The clock was ticking toward midnight on the world we'd always known. But for the first time since that terrible moment at the intersection of Mill Avenue and University Drive, I wasn't afraid. I was ready.